Okay, hello, participants. Welcome to the Research Synthesis Thematic Hub reading group. Because we have different participants, so let me just explain this again. The reading seminar is organized every 2 months, focusing on a published research synthesis study. In every seminar, we invite authors to share their experiences about their research process. Then we form discussions among participants in the seminar. This is our third seminar. We are so happy to have invited Tom and Owen, who is his supervisor, to co-lead today's seminar and talk about their collaborative experience of conducting a qualitative synthesis, which investigates the practitioner research on the conceptualization, optionalization, and evaluation of English language learner autonomy, especially within the context of Japan. And the seminar is recorded. You can use your camera and you can also turn off your camera and which way you feel comfortable with. So before we start to ask questions, let me invite Tom and Owen to introduce their background, experience. Yes, please. Yeah.
Tom, would you like to go first on that as the lead for this article?
Sure. So, hi everyone. On the article, I'm listed as Thomas Stringer, but please call me Tom. That's fine. And I have been doing some kind of English teaching or teaching adjacent educational activity since about 2008 in Japan. Right, so 17 years or so. I moved out here, and I've been here all of that time. I started the DProf in September 2022, so it's been about 3.5 years now, and this synthesis was published last November, so that might give you some kind of idea of where that is in the arc of my DProf. And I'm also, I work at a university here in Japan. I didn't start out working at universities. I started out working at senior high schools. So in Japan, they break up secondary education into kind of middle school and senior high school, which is the latter few years. So yeah, that's how I started. And then I eventually got a master's degree and I moved up to working at universities in Kansai. So Kansai is the name of a region. We have, probably you've heard of Kobe, Kyoto, Osaka, Nara. Those are kind of famous places. So I've been working at different universities around this region for about 8 years now, I think. And yeah, that's a little background on me there. Owen, how about you?
Yeah, so background on me. So hi, I'm Owen. I think I've met quite a few of you before at various points, but I am the director of the International Education Institute, and also importantly for this particular paper, I've been Tom's supervisor actually since he started the program in September 2022. So Tom was one of the earliest starts in the program, I think second intake, and we were still sort of working out how we do things. Typically, supervisees on the program will experience more than one first supervisor, but just the way it's worked out here, that's just been me. I think one reason Mark paired myself and Tom up was actually that I also started out my teaching career in Japan. So I was teaching and doing kind of administrative roles in Japan through primary school, so elementary level through to university level between 2001 and 2010. And then after that, I was working at a university in China called Xi'anjiaotong Liverpool University, which is a transnational collaboration between University of Liverpool and Xi'anjiaotong University in China, and then after that moving to St Andrews. So I guess the sort of background with Japan, that connection is quite, I think, pertinent to this particular paper that we're working on. And I should say also, if rewind several years, I don't think sort of secondary research and research synthesis. That was not really on my agenda as a sort of on my radar as a sort of new and emerging area of research. And I think it's fair to say, I know he's here as well, but we've all been kind of inspired by Sin-Wang as well in terms of the sort of potential of this area of research. And so before working with Tom on this particular piece of research, I'd also worked with a couple of master's students doing qualitative research synthesis or synthesis of research too. And that was a kind of precursor to working with Tom and supporting him doing this article too. And so, Jing, did you want us to talk about the article as well? Is that the or is that the kind of next section of this?
Yes, please give a brief presentation about the research, about the study, especially the methodological procedure, because we focus on the methodology, the process. Yes.
Sure.
Tom?
Do you want to sort of lead? I don't know if you. How about if you give a sort of brief overview of results and kind of get started with the methodology stuff, then maybe I can come in after that to pick up on some of the sort of supervisor perspective as well on this too.
Yeah. Let me see. Should I get the slides that I shared earlier in the chat? Would it be helpful to have those up on the screen, or are we good just to talk? Yeah. See some people nodding. I'll open those up again. Give me a second. Yeah. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay, I'm getting the thumbs up. So yes, we Owen mentioned being, or us all kind of being inspired by Sin-Wang's promotion and dedication to systematic secondary research. And I think that's true for everybody, but in a more pointed or specific sense, there was an actual particular paper of Sin-Wang's, which is listed here, Chong and Reinders. Now the year is 2025. It was 2022 originally. That was the impetus for, or one of the impetuses for starting this project. Okay, so as I mentioned, I started the DProf around September 2022. So it had just been published, I think, around that time. So I was getting to know Sin-Wang around that time and reading up on the work that he had done. And this was because autonomy is the area that I'm interested in. This paper came across my desk straight away. So in a very direct sense, this was something that we wanted to react to, or I wanted to react to. But I think not wanting to cover the same ground exactly again, we need to find a new angle on how we were going to address it. So rather than doing an international review, where in this paper by Sin-Wang and Hayo Reinders, they looked at many different countries and compared them, we thought that we would hone in on a context that we were both familiar with, which is Japan. Right there. So both Owen and I, as we mentioned, have quite a lot of familiarity with working and teaching here. And in particular, we were familiar with the kind of requirement of people in higher education here to publish research, and to publish research in particular in this area. So we thought it would be quite a fruitful way to funnel down from the international level to a context that we already had some knowledge about. And another thing that we wanted to do to differentiate our work was to specifically include research that was not only published in English, but in Japanese. So both Owen and I have a certain degree of proficiency in the Japanese language. So we thought we would evaluate both of those papers, both sets of papers. And that was something that we could also help us to differentiate ourselves from what was done in the scoping review earlier as well, because that was English language papers only. So we were thinking that we could do some kind of comparison between the international case and then the domestic case to see what was similar and what was different. So that was the broad idea behind what we did. We both knew from personal experience that there was a lot of research out there that might not be getting to the more broad public, right, outside of Japan, and we also wanted to elevate some of that. So we took the review questions from Sin Wang's earlier paper, and we just directly added in the Japanese context to each of them, right? So this would allow us to compare directly between the international context and the Japanese context, okay? So we established our inclusion criteria. We wanted to get recent research, so from the last 20 years or so, that would allow us to gather practitioner research that was relevant to teachers. That was, one kind of audience that we had in mind when we were thinking of this paper. So if it was, the history of autonomy is longer than this, but if it were too old, then it might not be relevant to today's teachers anymore. And of course, we put in the kind of typical things like it should be peer reviewed in order that we could have some idea of quality. Speaking of which, we adopted some other quality guidelines that we adapted, right, to suit our review. And we also used a kind of domestic research resource called CILTER, which you can see here. It's specifically focuses on indexing Japanese research from dissertations, from books, from publicly funded grants as well. It's all searchable on there. It's a tool that actually university students often use here in their own research as well. And importantly for our purposes, it was free to access. It has bilingual research, or at least research that's published in both languages and is searchable in both languages. And it also indexes in-house journals. So the kind of journals that might be published by institutions that practitioner researchers work at, as well as society journals. So like the Japan Association of College English Teachers and others. So we thought it would be a really, really useful tool for our search. We adapted the search string from the scoping review as well. So when I say adapted, Owen and I used our contextual knowledge to eliminate some of the search terms that we thought would be not relevant to the Japanese context. Maybe they were too idiomatic in English, right? They were not likely to come up. Or in other cases, we thought, oh, well, we know that there are multiple Japanese synonyms for such a word. So we devised an appropriate Japanese language search string to use. And then, Owen, am I continuing talking about the methods section? You're on.
Yep, sure. I mean, I can pick this up if you like as well.
Sure.
So just to go back as well to the whole point about secondary research, I think that some underlying things, certainly for me, about why this is important is that we're just living in an age where there is so much data being created across all sorts of media, and broadly, it just seems like a good and perhaps ethical thing to be trying to use some of that data that exists already and try to understand it, in addition to selectively thinking about generating new data as well. The other thing, I just go back in terms of the rationale. So obviously we've kind of pegged this and done comparisons with an international scoping review, but certainly one, I would say personally that one sort of tension I would see between sort of internationally focused syntheses of qualitative research is that qualitative research is often sort of developed and implemented in a paradigm or in a with the researchers believing that this is not about finding generalizable results that kind of you can generalize across different contexts. It's about a rich and deep understanding of a specific context. So there is a kind of tension, I think, sometimes between then synthesizing internationally research across multiple different contexts. So I think when we try and narrow that context a bit, in this case, the national context, and also, you know, perhaps level of education, those are also things you can look at too, that helps to somewhat address that tension too. So sorry, that was just to jump back, and then to go on to our selection strategy. Yep. So as Tom mentioned, we use CILTER, and I have to give credit to Tom. He was the lead researcher on this, but also there was quite a lot of work then from getting results to then actually transforming it into a usable format, because the download, the way that these things could be downloaded just didn't lend themselves very easily to being able to extract all of the data like abstracts and so on for them. And so in the end, what we ended up doing was downloading in batches of, I think it was 100, right, at a time, or 200, sorry, at a time. And then we started from there doing a kind of selective screening, going down from the top and picking out ones that met our inclusion criteria through the top 100. And we were kind of, sorry, the first 200. And we were from there sort of selectively going and assuming that once the relevance started to get much lower, that those are probably things that we weren't going to find any relevant results in lower ranked or lower numbered results. But in terms of the screening, so when we both independently screened, we could see that 29 of the papers in the top 100 had undergone some form of peer review, so instantly we excluded others. We then separately looked at title abstract screening against all of the criteria that we set up. As you can see on the slide, some it was clear include or exclude. There were some other unresolved where we had to discuss and come to a decision on that. As Tom's noted, actually there was much more quantitative research than we had initially expected. We were initially sort of thinking this could be focused primarily on mixed methods and qualitative research, but actually there was more quantitative than expected. So in the end, some of the quantitative papers we initially excluded, we re-reviewed, and that ended up giving us 18 papers in the end. I should perhaps add at this point as well, obviously we're working on this as a collaborative endeavor, but with Tom as the lead researcher, also very aware that this is a piece of work that will likely, when it comes to submission, find its way into Tom's portfolio for his DProf. So we were very cautious and careful about recording who did what. So there's a sort of massive document documenting every decision that was made, who has done different roles, and also highlighting very much that Tom has been leading this process at each stage too. So I think that's just an additional concern to think about when you're working on something with a supervisor, where you're potentially going to use that piece of work for submission purposes as well. So I think that's probably a sort of specific thing for doctoral students. I think realistically for a master's student doing a project, probably you would work on the project and then think about publishing it later on. But nonetheless, it's still very useful to keep clear records of who has done what and the roles respectively there. Did you want to add something on that, Tom?
Just that we started conceptualizing this and getting the ball rolling in early 2023. So April, May, possibly. And then it was published in November last year. So the whole process took 2.5 years. So that document that you referenced, where, it was not just keeping track of who did what, but it was the granular messages backwards and forwards between us as well, and all the little decisions we took, the screenshotting, the search results or whatever it was, little messages that we sent to each other on the Teams chat. It just made it a habit to drop all of those things in there, and then otherwise those would have been forgotten, I think, at some point. But then when it did come time to write up this later, having that admittedly quite messy record of our discussions was, I think, pretty valuable.
Yeah, I think it's very useful. I would say also the timeline there, some of the extension of that was probably due to delays on my part because of other priorities coming up, and then that's slowing things down a bit. But I think another important thing about that timeline is that during the process of working on this, you'll see, in fact, in the paper, we've cited the SMART guidelines that Sim-Wang published regarding research syntheses. That was only published after we had actually really done the bulk of the work. And so then we were kind of retrospectively looking at how what we had done had mapped onto that. And I think it's worth noting with any area of research, but also including synthesis, that sort of guidelines continue to develop and change, and it's important to be horizon scanning as well and just be looking at what the most up-to-date guidelines are, and recognizing also that we're working on this imperfectly, in that sometimes you might have done something before guidelines existed, and just trying to map and show comparisons with that as best possible. Should we move on to the next slide? Yep, so secondary screening, we independently evaluated the texts, and then we ended up with 14 after that. Again, this was a slower process just because it involved reviewing full text. So I think where you see some of that timeline extending is in between these sort of stages. There are kind of flurries of action, and then there's a kind of gap between these things. Should we move on to the next point there? Yep, so those are the studies that we ended up including. You can see one note here was that we ended up, and we did discuss this, but we did end up including quite a few studies by one particular author who'd published quite a lot in the area. But in terms of these being, separate publications, albeit sometimes with similar methodology, we felt that was justified, and they met the criteria, so we thought it would be inappropriate to just exclude on that basis. Should we go on to the next slide? Yeah, so extraction. Yep, so we initially did, both of us did 2 different data extraction on 2 of the studies, and then got together and compared that and just looked at how we were doing that to make sure we were kind of on the same page for doing that. And we did that, comparing asynchronously. We also discussed that in a supervision meeting as well to just make sure we were on the same page with how we were doing things. Then also after that, each of us separately assigned 6 papers each to then do data extraction on after that point. And that happened over a period of months. That was, I would say, fairly time consuming in terms of the process of this. And then we go on to coding. Yeah, I think perhaps with the coding, maybe I can hand back to you, Tom, as this was something you led on doing. So if I hand back to you for that bit.
Sure. So this started off with me having a first go at coding all of the data extraction templates that we'd used. And then, as I had mentioned before, doing this asynchronously and then synchronously, right? I did it separately, and then we'd come back together and compare. So that process was mirrored, I think, throughout what we did. But in order to make sure that we were working in the same way, first, we both took a Japanese paper and an English paper. From there, coded them separately, right? And then came back together, right? To make sure that what we were doing was synchronized. And then I went ahead and coded all of the papers from there, and then created an initial code book, which then we reviewed together in a supervision. Then Owen took the second round from there, right? And then reanalyzed the data extraction templates and adjusted the codebook accordingly, came back to me, and then we had another supervision where we talked through these changes. And then I took the main third round. Let me see if I can put that here, right? So you can get a little sense of the timeline there. And yes, that was December of 2024 until January 25. This is probably quite relevant to the profs, I think, in a practical sense of this project was quite long. If you're doing a research synthesis, yours might be quite too. And as Owen mentioned, there were barriers or events would come up, and it would mean that our collaboration had to be paused like for a little while, or one person could work and another couldn't, and all of these things. And just this time for the round 3, it was the end of the year, and I knew that I had to take this chance to knuckle down and do it. So I basically cut off everything else from the outside world for about 10 days, and I just worked on this solely. I would say I got up at 6. I worked on this for 4 hours or so. I took a little lunch break, exercised, and then went back and did it again in the afternoon, kind of thing, because this was when the like everything was finalized and started to concretize. And we were using NVivo, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with by now. It's recommended. And what I was doing was, while coding at the same time, right-clicking, identifying the different themes in there, I was also making extensive use of the note-taking function on there. So this is a recommended approach, I think, in qualitative research more broadly anyway. Like, you should be note-taking on what you're doing. But I started writing out very, very long form notes in this time, because I was really living and breathing only this paper at the time. And so I started typing out what then went on to become the results section and the discussion section. And what I was actually doing was we went through the data extraction template section by section like that. And I would actually write the results section and the discussion section directly, like immediately preceding it for each section of the template. These got separated out later on for inclusion in the paper, but being able to go, this is what we found, this was the implication, in that direct way in my mind, it really, really helped, solidify things for me. And then this is, what I came back to Owen with at the end of, at the start of January, when we had another supervision. So
is it worth actually just to jump in there, Tom, as well, just to note, we had some discussions about, obviously there was a mix of Japanese language and English language papers in the final batch of papers. So we had some discussions about, in terms of coding them, how would we represent things. So obviously the Japanese language original text was maintained, but the coding was just entirely done in English as well. I mean, I think that was just something we talked through, and that made the most sense to approach it that way.
Yeah, so I think we felt reasonably validated by our choice of approach there. We noted a lot of similarities between what had been reported in the scoping review and what we found, particularly in terms of how autonomy had been conceptualized and the prevalence of the different ways in which that is done, self-regulation, autonomy, different theories of learner psychology, for example, was quite similar between the two, but it also allowed us to identify particular, nuances and themes that were unique to the Japanese practitioner research context. So, for example, one was there was, quite a preponderance of non-experimental designs in our findings. In other words, I think only one of the 14 had a control group. If they were doing some kind of interventional work or collecting data at all, it was everyone was doing the same thing, for example, and that makes sense if these people are in the classroom teaching at the same time. That seems to be quite a natural choice. So that was, I think that's a good thing that came out of what we did, this kind of funnel idea going down from the larger international context to the national, highlighting similarities and differences is really, really what we wanted to do. So I think we felt that we achieved that. There were lots and lots of findings. It's a very long paper. One that jumped out at me, and it actually goes to the point that we were talking about earlier about the length of time that this paper took, was the distorting influence of competitive research funding on the results. So it definitely came across that quantitative survey-based studies were being funded vastly more than the few other types of studies that there were out there. I think I noticed this theme, but it took a very, very long time for me to notice that this was going on. I hadn't started to connect the dots on this, and I don't think I would have done if we had taken a short time over this study. It took a long time for me to start noticing, oh, this paper has a grant number listed at the bottom. Oh, wait, so does this one as well. So does this one too. And I didn't start, that theme it wouldn't have emerged quickly for me. So although Owen and I have talked about the kind of problems that have come along with this work taking a long time and the difficulties with it, in a real sense, that's a valuable thing to have taken so long over it, because it allowed this to percolate for me. And I think that was a contribution of the study as well.
Can I check on that as well, to pick up on that,
Yeah.
Tom? Just so I think you'd also noted that quite a lot of, were they separate funding applications or the same? There was the author we saw quite a lot of work from. We were seeing quite similar studies being funded again and again. I can't remember if that was one larger project or whether that was multiple funding applications.
So the same author had 2 consecutive grants, right? And we were seeing publications from both.
Yeah.
That was one. Yeah. But the same finding, the same thing was true of the other authors as well that had done funded research. They were doing similar kinds of survey-based work as well. Yeah. So, yeah. There's a lot of specific findings that we have in there, but I don't know, do you think maybe it would be a good time to open the floor for questions? Or is there anything you wanted to add first, Owen?
Yeah, I guess maybe just 2 things to add. I suppose one other part of the process as well was writing up, and I think just in terms of how we did that, Tom, you already noted you were kind of already drafting the results discussion sections as you were going through doing initial coding and working through with that. And so essentially you took charge of doing an initial draft for that latter part of the paper, and then we decided I would draft out the introduction, literature review, methodology sections, and then obviously feeding back and collaboratively working from there. But that was sort of how we kind of approached that. That was one thing to note. And the other is you've got the arrow on that current slide. For me, a really interesting point was that it was quite difficult to pick apart the researchers' relationships with the research for quite a few papers. And that's where that point there about greater clarity and role definition came from, because the way some of these papers were written, it wasn't always clear whether someone was sort of doing this as a teaching practitioner, as a researcher, or in fact as a complete, what their relationship was, because that often just wasn't stated at all. And it might have been written in a kind of passive voice, which also made it very unclear, that relationship. And I think that's a really, especially when you're dealing with qualitative research and looking at specific contexts, it's really important to know what the relationship of the researcher is with the research. And that was one thing we found quite consistently wasn't there in the papers we looked at.
Yeah, for sure. And we made not only use of that one document, but also at the end of the data extraction template, there's another box for notes, just general notes. And I think that's another way that we exchanged our thoughts, and this theme kind of emerged from there as well. So I suppose the underlying message is take advantage of every opportunity you have to just get your thoughts down somewhere and then discuss them with each other, because you never know what you're going to find. And just to the other point that you were mentioning, Owen, I think the results, discussion, and conclusion were the bits that I led the initial part on, were about 16,000 words or so in length out of a 20,000 word paper. So, and then the bit that you did, the introduction, literature review, and the methods, that was about 4,000 words in total. So we, in that sense as well, in terms of the initial contribution, we thought that was a good split or a good ratio there that we adopted. But I would say, because me leading is part of the point of this as well, that even on all of those methodological decisions, they were mine initially, as Owen mentioned. It was just the writing up them into the paper that was, Owen took the first draft of that. And then as with the coding, we went backwards and forwards between the two of us. The same was true with the writing as well. So I did the first draft of my part. Owen commented, made changes, feedback, and gave it back to me. And I did the same thing with him in reverse with his part. So yeah, that kind of back and forth was, that's how we approached pretty much every aspect of the paper, I think.
And that massive long document of keeping track of decisions, what would be done, that was so helpful when I came to drafting the methodology section. So yeah.
Yeah.
So I think, Jean, that's probably us.
Thank you for sharing the information about how you conducted the collaborative work. It's really useful, because some of the information we just couldn't read. I mean, it's the same with every research synthesis. Some information we just couldn't read from the publication. Thank you so much for presenting. So now, participants, shall we ask questions if you have? Yes, Amira, please.
Hi, thank you so much for being so transparent and sharing the whole process. I was just making some notes while both of you were talking. The first thing I wanted to ask about was the CINI, the search database that you mentioned. and it's how unique it is, especially both of you coming from bilingual experiences and having both lived in Japan. You can definitely see that insider reflexivity experience being done. So I appreciate that you wanted to use a database that wasn't so Anglo-centric in its documentation. Can you tell us a bit more about how it was able to go beyond English-only literature, and how that might assist other people? So, for example, in the Gulf, where Marwa and I are based, a lot of the reports, the publications, the internal reports are often published in English, and that influences research synthesis that we get exposed to. So I'd just like to hear more about that.
Right. So we made an English search string and a Japanese search string as well. We intended to use both of them. However, when we did use the Japanese one, it didn't furnish any new results. So this SciNE page is set up. We learned that it will find the tagging in both languages. Perhaps there's some inbuilt translation feature on it. I think also even the Japanese language papers tended to have English language abstract as well, which helped. And the keywords are often listed in English too. So that helped. There are other Japan-specific databases as well that we could have searched, but they didn't have quite the coverage that we wanted in the area of applied linguistics and TESOL. So our search was really, really guided by the availability of this tool. I'm not familiar with the Gulf or if similar search tools that are so geographically specific exist that you could access, but you know, that would be a really interesting thing for you to look at. I think a lot of our research decisions were guided by what was available to us, right? Rather than sticking to a predefined plan. Right, Owen?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a certain amount, I think, of any research project which is matching what resources are available to you, what capacities do you currently have, and how do you utilize them as best possible to achieve sort of something meaningful in terms of the research. So, but to go back to Cine, I mean, I think both of our familiarity, to the degree that we are familiar with the Japanese context, pointed to the fact that certainly in Japan that there seems to be a strong ethos of kind of publishing locally. I know promotion criteria in universities often, or this may be changing, but certainly have not necessarily prioritized international peer review publications over sort of local publications in the same way that perhaps exists in let's say in the UK. And so yeah, that there is a kind of culture of sort of research findings being shared through society journals, through local journals, perhaps in a way that happens more than maybe in some other geographical areas. Although I can't say that with total confidence, but certainly that it exists. And Cine, I've put the text from the article here. It is a pretty comprehensive database that includes searching some of those journals, and you know, is very much tied to the Japanese context. I'm less sure about in the Gulf, where I think I'm less familiar with the context as a whole, so I'm not sure how much, for example, there is in terms of Arabic language academic publication. But I would say in Japan there is a fairly substantial amount of Japanese language publication, which is otherwise an untapped resource. And of course, you know, I won't also pretend that you know, to review when we were doing data extraction and reviewing articles, it certainly took me longer to do the Japanese ones than the English ones. But then that was also the distinctive sort of focus of the study.
I would also say that efforts like signee are quite modern, quite new, recent, I mean. And what Owen and I found when we searched with it was often some of the society journals or the in-house journals, the online version of record that was there was just a scanned copy of the paper version of the journal that had been printed, and somebody had actually put that scan on there. So it's even here, it's a kind of work in progress that this domestically focused resource is being rolled out. So we were just fortunate that that was there, and that we could use our knowledge of Japan and the fact that it has this kind of team player culture. Like you should be publishing in the in-house journal. You should be publishing in the little society journal, because that's good for the institution, rather than just seeking personal glory by shooting for the high value targets, right, on your own. We were just able to leverage our knowledge of the local context and our language abilities, plus the technological abilities that was there as well. So I'm not sure if we answered your question. I hope we did. But I think the message is, think about what capabilities you have, right? And then let that guide your work, maybe.
Yeah. I think though on the question was about the database specifically, and I think that obviously this exists in the Japanese context, so therefore it's an interesting resource to utilize. It might be worth having a look around to see in the Gulf context or in UAE specifically, you know, is there anything that is being developed or that could be useful to look at. The other thing I think I noted when we were reviewing Japanese papers and extracting data from them is that often the structure might be quite different to some of the English language publications, just in terms of the kind of just the structure of writing, the sort of information to be included, what order it was in as well, and that sort of it just meant it took more time to kind of find things sometimes and put it into our template, which is very much sort of based around what you might expect to find in English language publications.
Should we move on? Is there another question? Donald?
Hi, yeah. You hear me okay? Good.
Yep.
I was just wondering how you got on with developing the search strings, because I know from my own experience it took a lot of trial and error to actually get the kind of number of results I was looking for. So did you have to kind of play around with the terminology you were using?
Yes. So as with, I said the research questions, we borrowed them from the scoping review, and we just added in the Japanese context. We wanted to stay as close as we could to the scoping review to maximize our ability to compare the two contexts. So we started off with the English language string from the Chong and Reinders paper in there. I think it's one of the first things that's copy pasted into this very, very long, messy document that Owen and I have talked about a few times, that we used to kind of anchor our collaboration. And then we used our contextual knowledge of Japan to eliminate some terms that we thought were duplicates or would not be relevant to the Japanese context. For example, I think there was something like learning in the wild. Okay, that was in the English one. And we felt that was far too idiomatic in English to be found in a paper in Japan. We didn't think that would have been listed as a keyword, so we removed that one, I think, And then conversely, on the Japanese side, when we were making the Japanese language string, which we didn't end up using that much, again, we know that there are synonyms for certain terms that are not present in English, right? But that are in Japanese. So it was a case of discursively going backwards and forwards between the two of us and using our judgment and our knowledge of the context and the language to refine what we wanted to do. So it was, yeah, I think our entire approach throughout the paper was quite, every stage of the paper was discursive, just batting these things backwards and forwards between us, right?
Yeah, I think also, Donald, I don't know what your experience has been exactly, but in any of these sort of projects that I've been involved in, the result, the problem doesn't seem to be the result, the search string not returning enough results or hits. The problem is when you get to matching them against your inclusion criteria and then finding that there's not enough that tie that. I don't know if that was your experience as well, because certainly other projects, it's been the point of kind of mapping against the inclusion criteria that's led to kind of some rethinks about maybe how we might adjust those criteria as well.
Yeah, for me it was just like sometimes I would put a certain term in and it seemed to kind of mess up the search in a particular database. And then when I tweaked it for that database, I got more of what I was looking for.
Hmm.
You know, it could have just been like removing the little asterisks at some point and writing the full word or something really basic like that. So I felt it was quite a fiddle. But that seems to be in a different process for you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're saying moving the asterisk, is that you were using sort of wildcard characters and things like that? Yeah, I mean, I need to go back and check, but I don't think we were using any wildcard characters as well. But I am aware that from doing some JavaScript coding before and using sort of regular expressions, that there's quite possibly slightly different rules that different databases might be using to search with for some of those kind of wildcard type things. So I wonder if that might have been what you were running into, that some databases have one sort of set of regular expression algorithms behind them and another has a different one.
Most likely, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Donald.
Are there any other questions? Penny.
Okay, well, thank you again. I was wondering, you referred to your podcast as well on that. And I think right now you talked about this difficulty of distinguishing the roles between practitioners and researchers. So I would really like to know more about how you handle it while you were doing your codings and you were analyzing your data.
You mean how did we handle it when it was unclear?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, so at the data extraction stage, I would say it started by, we used the template again that we borrowed from Sin Wang's paper, and just at the end there was a section just called notes. So it was just starting there, just writing down our impressions, and it wasn't for public consumption, as it were. It was just for us on the back end going, wow, I really can't tell what was the aim here, or why was this action taken, or why is there some lack of clarity going on here? Are they intending this to be a teaching tool? Is it both being intended as a teaching tool or as a research tool at the same time? So it really started then. And then in the coding process itself, in Vivo, you have lots of functions that are available to you for starting, you mean in this kind of granular way, right? You can make little notes, like text-based notes that whenever you hover over the text that's in there, just pop up. So if you want, or you can use the much longer form note taking. It's more like a basic word processor feature. And you can bold, underline, italicize. That's about it. So keeping those kind of discursive notes that are alongside when you are actually coding as well was another thing. And then of course the coding as well. So identifying specific cases then and dropping them into a code in Vivo when you thought it was unclear for some reason. Yeah, those are some very practical things about how we handle that. Owen, did you have anything to add?
Nothing really to add on top of that, but yeah, I mean, I just think so there were huge amounts of data collected, and yeah, it was just about primarily Tom, you kind of making sure you're on top of organizing all of these notes in a way that made them easily accessible. And I've just also responded to Amira, your question there about
Thank you.
yeah, so it was just the record keeping was just one massive Word document that grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, which was useful. I mean, I have to say, I use OneNote for a variety of things, and in fact, we use that for Tom. You use that for recording your meeting notes, supervision meeting notes, and everything, and it is useful, but Word was just given that we drafted the actual final piece of work in Word. I just found it easier to work with having that in Word as well. That was quite beneficial because maybe I'm just not proficient enough with OneNote to make all of the kind of sidebars disappear easily, and sometimes formatting, when you want to copy something across, it doesn't always format in the same way. So it's just it worked quite well, I think, having it in Word was what I meant to say. And I suppose there's probably more that just reflecting on it now, to make a very long document easier. I mean, there's other things we didn't do, but you could do, like using headings and then making a table of contents, so you can easily then just control click to sort of skip to the section you want to look at as well. So I'd say that worked pretty well from my point of view.
Yeah, thank you. Because I heard you mention a few times when it comes to perhaps the transfer of view, or later on as part of a portfolio when we're documenting our outputs or our decisions, there may be times when we have to refer to evidence that. So I wasn't sure if there is a particular audit trail people had kept as part of their artifacts or something more formal. If not,
I think in ours, we were maybe, I don't have it off the top of my mind, Sin-Wang would probably know it better, but it was a qualitative synthesis of research he published with another researcher kind of just before or around the time that we did our paper, and in that they mentioned having a similar document, right? Just a document where they'd throw in their kind of thoughts in as we went, and it just seemed intuitively like a thing that would work for us. Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a more general point, maybe, Amira, you're mentioning there as well, about being able to track back into how decisions are made, why they were made. And I think that's something, there's multiple layers to that. I think the Word document we're talking about, that was for this specific research project. But then also, if I think about my supervision of Tom and what Tom's doing, when Tom, and he can talk for himself on this, but wants to reflect back and see why did he do something, there's a massive audit trail of all of those meeting notes where decisions have been recorded, and that some of those are just copied across from the Word document or vice versa as well. But there's sort of the layer of why did the whole portfolio of projects develop in the way it has, that's the supervision notes. And then there's this project has its own kind of document as well, separate to that. And I'd say that's pretty thorough, and likely to be very useful as well for reflecting back on the later on.
Mm. Any other questions? Sinwang.
Thanks, Thomas and Owen. That's really interesting. I'm very, in particular, I'm intrigued by the so-called small ends approach to research synthesis, and that's something I've tried to promote everywhere I go. That's a term that's borrowed from Emma Ushioda's motivation research, that she talked about small ends, and I think that's a very good way to think about synthesis, that kind of honing into a local context. And I think that's what you have opted to do, and that turned out to be a very fine piece of work. But on top of that, what's interesting is that you have that very explicit practitioner focus. And I'm very interested to know how that decision has influenced your methodological decision making throughout the process, because you're writing this piece potentially for practitioners, of course, for researchers as well, and also looking at potentially research that was written by practitioners, about practitioners, for practitioners. So how did that influence your decisions throughout the research process?
I don't remember exactly what the moment was that we decided to focus specifically on the practitioner, but it was a key moment, I would say. I think, having been one in Japan for a long time, and Owen too, and having a knowledge of the context, we both knew that on the one hand, teachers are required to do research work. On the other hand, it's not always explicitly written as part of the job description, but it's, so it's there. So we knew that it was going to be an important and a relevant factor. So I think it's just because the project was so long, we had to keep reminding ourselves, or sorry, I don't want to speak for Owen. I had to keep reminding myself that when I was writing this, not to drift off and to keep the focus narrow on, is this useful? Is this useful information? And I think that's also something that the peer reviewers also brought up, maybe where we had not successfully done that, where we had not kept it close enough to achieving that aim. It's a hard thing to do, right? To keep that, like, who is the audience? Who is the audience? Who is the audience in mind the entire time? So one of the most important sections of the paper is the end, right? The recommendations, and they're all directly tied to, how is this useful for you in the classroom? What can we recommend for you doing? Yeah. Owen?
Yeah, I think certainly through the peer review process, there were definitely comments about making sure that, what do we mean by practitioners, was one of the comments, and how do we know if something is practitioner research. And so I think when we were screening and going through, I need to go back and check the exact criteria we put, but we were looking carefully at the relationship between the researcher and the research. We're also aware that there's a sort of context, certainly within Japan, where people who are expected to do research, if they're working in higher education in most contexts, but at the same time, the centerpiece of their role is likely to be being a practitioner teaching English in the classroom, which I think might be slightly different to some other contexts where you've got people involved in teacher education, sort of, who are doing a lot of the research. So that was also something that drove this focus, a sort of knowledge that there is essentially, there's, I think, as Tom was mentioning earlier, there's a huge body of people who are, their day-to-day role is going to be teaching English to students at Japanese universities, and that they're also going to be publishing stuff. What's happening to that? How can we utilize that and learn about autonomy in that context from what they're doing? So that, I mean, but I need to go back and check again on how we did the filtering of the papers again to check on that. But certainly that was one of the things we were kind of looking at and thinking about the society journals as being key areas where these sort of people would be publishing as well, and trying to target it like that, and that SINE in general would be something like that.
Yeah, and you know, I did job hunting within the last year in Japan. I got a new job, and you know,
congratulations again on that.
Oh, thank you, thank you. I wasn't saying it in that way to big myself up, but going through the job hunting process and looking at what is asked of candidates, it's to have these research papers listed on there. But then when you look at the content of the job, research isn't a stipulation, like you must be involved in this. Like as Owen said, they're teaching focused positions, and yet that expectation is also hanging there because it's a desirable or a requirement to apply for these jobs. So is that a implicit or an explicit? It seems pretty explicit expectation there, even if it's not recognized. So I think again, the thing I would want to bring this back to is when you are choosing your research focus is just definitely think about what you know well and what you have deep knowledge of. And then we tried to get as clear an idea as we could of what it was that we wanted to investigate and just keep that idea in our head the whole time, like at every stage of the decision-making process. Yeah. Did we answer your question, Sinwan?
Definitely. Thanks.
Okay. Amira?
Hi, thank you. I have another question when you were mentioning some definitions. So thank you for making 3 very specific research questions: the conceptualization, the operationalization, and the third one I've forgotten. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Conceptualization, operationalization, evaluation.
Evaluation, yeah. That's very concise. Thank you. So early on, you had given definitions when I was reading the paper of practitioner, research practitioners, and you'd also defined learner autonomy. And one of your research questions was really conceptualizing learner autonomy within the Japanese concept. So how did you find that your paper had moved beyond just providing the definition and creating a construct of autonomy? And was it different using the Japanese context as opposed to the international initial synthesis which Singwan had published?
So although there were many differences in the methodology, right, in how the studies were conducted in the Japanese context versus the international one, I have to say that in terms of just the conceptualization, it was remarkably similar. In fact, the same themes in pretty much the same order of prevalence, right, came up. The most common way that autonomy was conceptualized was as self-regulation, and then second was autonomy, and then third, I think, it was variously, motivation or self-efficacy or some kind of psychological aspect of learning, came up there. And I think that was broadly the same between the two. So I wouldn't say that we set out to reconceptualize it at all. We were just describing what was there. And it was interesting. It was interesting to me to see that it was the Japanese researchers had been borrowing or conceptualizing autonomy in the same way. Another finding related to conceptualization or theorization was that a lot of the papers didn't have a very strong theoretical framework underlying them. They borrowed parts from not famous is the wrong word, the well-known autonomy authors. someone mentioned Emma Oshioda before. I think she was in there, right, on motivation as well. But they often weren't, the papers didn't often refer to a specific conceptual framework, right? Which is from there. That also was a finding in the scoping review as well. So yeah, that interested me a lot. That there was such a methodological difference, but not a conceptual difference. Bradford?
Hi, yeah, thank you. My question is kind of related to the last two, actually, talking about the usefulness of study and doing the research and thinking about that, and also the other question about the different contexts. So if you had found as a researcher that the results, when you're discussing them, you had a lot of results that either were extremely similar and there wasn't much differentiation between the scoping review, or on the other hand, you had found that compared to the scoping review, everything was coming out differently. I know you mentioned that there was this kind of, it felt like this vindicating balance of new points as well as like things that were resembling the previous research. But if that had not been the case, what do you think your next steps would have been in the research process?
If we had not found any differences, any major differences?
Yeah, sorry, there was actually two questions. On one hand, if you had found that all the research there was not much differentiation. And then the second question on the opposite side, if you had found that there was only differentiation and it was quite divergent from that.
I mean, Owen, you might view this differently, I'm not sure, but I was just interested to learn whatever came up from it. I had an interest in the topic more broadly, but I wasn't invested particularly in finding out that the Japanese context was very similar to the international context, or that it was different. I would have been equally curious and interested in the results of either, and I would have, in either case, it would have been something that we could have interpreted, right, and looked into why, and leveraged the fact that both Owen and I have spent a lot of years here and know, sorry, I mean here in Japan, and know the context deeply. That would have helped us to interpret it. Yeah, so we used a kind of grounded theory approach to the coding, and yeah, similarly, we're working very bottom up here. Just what is there, trying not to let our preconceptions color our expectations too much. Owen?
Yeah, I mean, I think if part of the question here, Bradford, thank you for the question, Bradford, but is about, yeah, what would we have done, and also what are the implications of the different possible findings that could have come out of there. I think, firstly, to step back, learner autonomy is a topic of some interest in Japan, and so my sense is as well, some of that is driven by quite a few contexts where there are sort of ambitious learning goals for students, but not many contact hours that necessarily go with them. And so therefore, sort of attention starts to turn to how do we get language learning happening outside of those contact hours, and you know, learner autonomy is an important part of that. But if the finding had been that you know, there was very little in terms of conceptualization of autonomy that overlapped between what we saw in Japan and sort of the international synthesis, then I think one implication from that would have been, well, there's a real opportunity here to perhaps learn from some of this conceptualization that's happening outside of Japan. If it's very similar, I think there's an element of recognizing that, okay, so already that theory is in place, and that's, you know, people have got a good understanding of the conceptualization that's happening globally. So potentially there's sort of more implications for practitioners there if it's a finding of a lot of difference. But then also, you know, got to think of the broader context here where I forget the exact term, publication bias, or what the sort of problem of only publishing positive results to research, which kind of skews the overall findings here. I mean, it's important to note if it is just that everything is the same, and that doesn't seem very exciting, that's still an important finding to note in terms of being clear that this is maybe an area that doesn't need much attention. And I think ultimately the finding was a sort of nuanced finding somewhere in between those two poles.
Yeah, one thing that interested me a lot, a benefit of being able to focus more tightly in on the local context than Sinwang and Higher Reiners were able to do in their scoping review was we could focus in on little details like the year of the participants. I mean, which academic year of study were they in? So it turned out in ours, almost all of them were using freshmen, or sorry, what they call in the US freshmen, like first year undergraduates, I mean. So we were able to find that this obviously is a key time in Japan because it marks the transition from a certain type of learning that's happening in secondary education to university education, which has a very different set of goals and expectations and things. So justifiably so, this period has been researched a lot, right? We were able to take that and say, oh, well, maybe, they should, this area has been researched enough. Let's go look at other key transitional periods, right? In Japanese, something. How about, as future studies go and investigate the transition out of higher education, right, into being a member of the workforce, right? Or another reason that a lot of these studies focused on the early years or the first year of education is that English is being studied as a requirement for their degree, the completion of the degree. So they have to be there, right? Well, how about going and researching learners that go and take elective classes? Instead, in their third or fourth year, right, they're choosing to be there when they don't have to be there anymore. So yes, definitely, we would have found things to talk about, or when we did find things to talk about when the findings were similar to the international context. But yes, it was really, really interesting for me to dig into those differences that we found, and that we could kind of make the study our own and make some very specific local recommendations as well. I think this goes back to what Sinwang was asking us about earlier, about how to keep this relevant. I was trying to think, what can we contribute back to our particular context that we're working in?
I mean, just a thought actually on this, if I was sort of being cynical about this too, if you put together a few things, the sort of expectation for professional progression that you do some research, even if just teaching English is your core focus, plus the over allocation, it would seem, of funding to questionnaire studies, and then the fact that in first year of undergraduate where English is a compulsory subject, you're more likely to have big groups of students who will then give you higher numbers of questionnaire responses, have all of these kind of just come together to make some people who think, well, okay, I need to do some research. I want a lot of people to respond to my questionnaire. Let's do a questionnaire study. It's going to work better with the first year students because there's lots of them. And has that just ended up with this focus on year one? That's a sort of cynical look at it, but that is a possibility as well. I think also, by the way, there's a question in the chat, Tom, from Marwa. I don't know if you were able to see that.
If this paper or the findings have inspired you to do another study. Well, yeah, for sure. So this is part of my portfolio. So it's, it's part of a series of projects that I'm doing. And while I wouldn't say that this has inspired me to do something that brand new that wasn't already in progress, it's definitely helped me deepen my contextual understanding, of here, because all of my projects relate to the Japanese context. So when it comes to interpreting information or data rather from primary studies that I've already done, what I've learned is invaluable there, right? It's super, super invaluable, and possibly in the future as well. That all those things that we just talked about there, it would definitely factor into which kind of students I chose to do a project with, for example, or it might, change the research direction for sure. Yeah. Currently, I would say it's more on the interpretation of data side, right? Yeah.
And I guess I don't want to speak completely for you here, Tom, but if the question was also, has it inspired you to do another research synthesis project? Presumably the answer would be after you've completed all the other follow-on research that you were planning to do for the
Yes.
DSOF portfolio.
Yeah, that's right. I definitely would do another one in the future, but yes, there's plenty on my plate currently to be working on as well. Sinwang, you raise your hand again.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to go back to the questions about the research logbook or notebook or just audit trail of the process. And somebody asked for like an example of that. And I happen to have an example here, so if that's okay, Thomas, that I kind of share my screen briefly. It's in no way a perfect example, but I think it's a decent example to show people. So I'm going to show you what it's there. Also, people ask about the paper. I think, Tom, you also mentioned the paper that I co-authored with a former student. And I'm going to share that paper so that you can have a reference of, looking at how it worked. So let me just share my screen really quickly. Can you see my screen? Yep. So this is from an ongoing project. It's, I would say, one of the largest synthesis projects I'm involved in. So this is a Ball commissioned synthesis project, the British Association for Applied Linguistics. I'm working with 10 research assistants at the moment, and then 13 advisory board members. So it's a big team, and all of that makes kind of keeping track of everything and having a shared understanding super important. And this is what the logbook looked like. So we call it a researcher logbook. I didn't create this logbook. One of my research assistants did, and she did a fabulous job. I just want to show you what components are there. I don't think we need to do with that exhaustively, but this is just an example. So there are different things here, and there are different functions of a logbook, right? So some of that may relate to just documenting when the search took place, because sometimes you didn't get the search string right, and you want to just make sure that when you did an updated search, you start from where you left off last time. So here you could see the search date here, and just keeping track of how many results, and then kind of reflecting again whether that's still feasible, whether we have to tweak something, and then just kind of copying and pasting some of the results there. So that's one way to use your logbook. The other way that my team have been using the logbook is almost like a standardization process. It's like if you teach a class and you mark and you have that standardization process to make sure that different people are kind of looking at the same thing the same way. So this is the inclusion-exclusion checklist that my team developed, and it's slightly different from other checklists. It's not just a list of criteria. It's basically telling you which criterion to look at first. So when we look at an abstract or a full paper, among all the criteria, we're saying, let's prioritize this particular criterion. If it's relevant, then include it. If it's not, then we have to go and see the next criterion. So we're kind of breaking it down to a very granular level. It's quite top down in a sense, but that's something that we have to think about because we're working with 10 reviewers at the same time. So you may not want to do that. That may be an overkill for you, but that's another function. The third way that we use the logbook is just to keep track of what happened, when that happened. So this is very detailed, and so it's good to kind of just keep track of when things happened. And from a funder's perspective, they also kind of appreciate this because they know that, you know, things are going on, and we've been doing a lot of work. And of course, the meeting notes that Tom kind of shared as well. So we kind of talked about what we discussed, what were some of the lessons learned, what we needed to do before the next meeting. So that's what we did as well. So that's just an example, but it's a big document, as Tom said. But it's a mechanism that you can kind of mention in your paper that it potentially enhances your kind of the rigor of the review, because, you know, everything is quite transparent. The paper that Tom talked about, which I believe is this one, which is a publication that came out a few years ago, and then we kind of introduced the idea of using a researcher logbook. She's currently working at IELLI, actually, as an honorary research assistant. She was my master's student before, and we worked on this dissertation together when I still worked at Queen's University, Belfast. And then we kind of experimented with the logbook idea, and you could see some examples there as well. So I'm going to share that in the chat. One last kind of suggestion of resource is this book that is coming out, I believe, which is a BIRA kind of case studies on research ethics in educational research. This book came out, I think just came out, to complement the latest BIRA ethical guidelines. And there are lots of things about different issues in educational research ethically, but in particular, there is a chapter where I wrote about supervised evidence syntheses, and that's like in terms of the power inequalities. And we kind of had two pairs of supervisor-supervisee, kind of writing about how they kind of implement that reflexivity, making sure it's a dialogic process, it's a reflexive process. So that potentially is quite interesting for people who are kind of thinking about doing this kind of synthesis. Because one thing that I've been talking to people in terms of intercoder reliability, which people love to talk about, and I think it's important in terms of agreement rate, right? Agreement percentage, and we all know about like 80%. But that doesn't really tell us. I mean, that only tells us the outcome of agreement. It doesn't tell us how we reach that agreement, right? Just imagine in a supervised context where the supervisors and the supervisees are doing the agreement exercise, the calibration exercise. It's very likely that the students will be kind of convinced by the supervisor to say, yeah, oh, because you agree, you say this is one that we need to include, then of course. Then of course the agreement rate is very high, but we don't actually know what happened. So the logbook is actually documenting the process, right? And I think both are important. Sorry about the rather long message, but I'll just put the links in the chat. But I hope it's helpful.
No, that was super helpful, and yes, that was exactly the paper that I was talking about as well. Yeah, I valued having that resource there, and I valued the discussions that Owen and I had like around that. I didn't feel at any time there was any power imbalance, or that you were, you know, forcing some kind of interpretation on me when it wasn't there. I would say that was something else. Like, you know, Owen, you were really, really supportive in letting me or take this where I wanted to go with it as well. So yeah, there was at the start of the meeting, you said, I think Mark just put us together because of the Japan connection, but I think, you know, over the time we've developed a good working relationship as well. So that was another really, really important factor in making this a success.
And without wanting to turn this into a mutual backpatting exercise, then but you know, I think that's also been thanks to you taking a kind of lead and being really proactive with these things as well. But that's yeah, good. One other final thing, I realize we're out of time, but just to go back to those SMART guidelines that were developed and published after we had already sort of done most of the work on this. So those also do indicate that rater agreement percentage is something that should be included. Obviously, we hadn't done that because at the time we were working on this, we hadn't, that wasn't on our radar to do that, or inter-rater agreement, sorry. But I think that's just another example of, you know, us doing this and then thinking if we were to do this again, that's something that we would be paying more attention to, I think, next time.
That's right.
All right. So thanks, Thomas and Owen. I'm just jumping in to kind of round things up because Jing had to go to teach. Sure. But thanks both for sharing your experience. Really, really helpful. I'm all for kind of talking about standards and innovation. I think we need standards there, but we also need to be innovative when it comes to doing research because of all the constraints and interesting topics that we're exploring. But thanks for your interest in the reading group. As Jing mentioned, this is already our third one. It's highly successful, and I attend every one of them. I love them. I feel like I get a lot more from these events than kind of lectures and reading papers. I hope you enjoyed that dialogue and kind of seeing that emergent community forming in terms of people who are interested in syntheses. We're doing this every 2 months, as Jing said. So the next one will be in March, and Jing will be sharing more details later on. So thank you very much for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I hope I will see you soon.
Yeah.
Great.
Thanks
Cheers.
for coming,
thanks
everyone.
to Jing. Yeah, thanks to
Yes.
everyone for coming.
Thank
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Bye, guys. Thanks.